My name is Sister Angela Romano, and on the night of March 12th, 2017, my life changed forever. I had spent years in service to God, devoting my days to prayer, teaching, and caring for those in need. But when I was diagnosed with advanced stage cancer, I knew my time on earth was coming to an end. The doctors told me there was nothing more they could do, and my sisters in the convent prepared for my passing. But what none of us knew was that death was not the end of my journey. It was only the beginning. The last thing I remembered was the soft glow of candlelight in my room and the whispered prayers of my sisters surrounding me. My body was too weak to move, too exhausted to even open my eyes, but in my heart I was at peace. Then, in an instant, the pain was gone. The weakness, the suffering, the weight of sickness, it all disappeared as if it had never existed. I opened my eyes, but I was no longer in my bed. Instead, I was floating above my body, looking down at the pale, lifeless figure that I had once called my own. The sisters were still praying, their hands clutching their rosaries, their voices trembling with grief. But I felt no sadness, no fear, only a calling, a pull towards something far greater. Then I saw the light. It was not like any light I had ever seen before. It was not just bright, it was alive. It pulsed with a presence so powerful, so overwhelming, that I could feel it reaching deep into my soul. It was warm, familiar, and filled with a love beyond human understanding. I felt myself being drawn toward it, not by force, but by an irresistible pull that spoke to the very core of who I was. And as I moved closer, I knew I was going home. The closer I got, the more I could feel something incredible surrounding me, a love so deep, so pure, that it wrapped around me like an embrace. It was not just an emotion, it was a presence, a force greater than anything I had ever known. It filled every part of me, erasing every fear, every doubt, every pain I had ever carried. Then I felt him. I didn't need to see his face to know who he was. I had spent my entire life praying to him, serving him, seeking him. And now here he was, standing before me, Jesus. When he stepped forward, I was completely overwhelmed by his love. It wasn't like the love we experience on earth. Conditional, fragile, sometimes fleeting. His love was infinite, absolute, unshakable. In that moment, I realized that he had known me all along. Every prayer I had whispered, every struggle I had endured, every time I had doubted myself or felt unworthy, he had seen it all. And yet, there was no disappointment in his eyes, no judgment, only pure, unending love. Without a word, he reached out his hand. The moment I touched it, everything around us shifted. The light grew even brighter, and suddenly I was no longer standing in an empty space. I was somewhere new, somewhere I had only dreamed about. I gasped as I looked around, taking in the breathtaking beauty that surrounded me. I was in heaven. The very air around me felt alive, filled with something I couldn't describe. A presence, a peace, a love so overwhelming that it brought tears to my eyes. The light wasn't just shining down from above. It was woven into everything, the sky, the ground, the very essence of this place. I had spent my entire life imagining heaven, picturing what it might be like, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was seeing. It was more real than anything I had ever known. I turned slowly, taking it all in. There were gardens stretching endlessly, filled with flowers of colors I had never seen before. They glowed as if lit from within, their petals moving gently as if they were alive. The trees were tall and majestic, their leaves shimmering with a golden radiance that seemed to pulse with life. And then I heard it, a sound so beautiful it sent a shiver through me. Music, but not like any music I had ever heard. It wasn't coming from an instrument. It was woven into everything, flowing through the air like a song that had always been there, waiting for me to finally hear it. Then I saw them. People. At first, they were distant figures, but as I moved forward, I realized that I knew them. Some of them were loved ones I had lost, their faces glowing with a joy so complete that it nearly took my breath away. Others were strangers, yet somehow I still knew them, not by name, but by spirit. There were no barriers here, no separation, no division, only unity, only love. And as I looked into their faces, I realized something else. They knew me, too. As I walked deeper into this place, I felt lighter than I had ever felt before, as if every burden I had carried in life had been lifted. There was no sorrow, no regret, no fear, only pure, endless joy. The people around me were not just happy. They were completely whole, as if every part of them had been restored to what God had always intended them to be. There were no signs of pain, no traces of a suffering they had once endured on earth. It was as if they had been reborn into a perfect, eternal peace. Then I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding with a realization I couldn't yet put into words. Was this where I would stay? Was my journey on earth truly over? I wanted to ask, but before I could, he reached out his hand again. The moment he touched me, everything shifted once more. The gardens, the trees, the music, they all faded into something new. I was no longer standing in an open paradise. Instead, before me stood something so vast, so glorious, that I felt unworthy even to look upon it. It was a city, radiant, golden, and beyond anything I could have ever imagined. The walls shimmered as if they were made of light itself, stretching high into a sky that glowed with a divine brilliance that had no source, yet illuminated everything. The streets were not paved with stone or dirt, but something else, something that reflected the glory of God in a way that made my soul tremble with awe. And then I saw them again, angels moving with purpose, their voices blending into the most beautiful, heavenly song. This was not just a paradise. This was the very heart of God's kingdom. I turned to Jesus, my heart overflowing with wonder. "Is this what you have prepared for us?" I asked. He smiled, his eyes filled with the kind of love that made me feel like I was the only soul in all of creation. "Yes," he said simply, "this is my Father's house." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked around, overwhelmed by the perfection, the holiness, the sheer majesty of where I stood. This was the home God had prepared for those who loved him, a place of eternal peace, eternal joy, eternal belonging. I had always believed in heaven, always trusted in God's promises, but now, standing in the very midst of it, I truly understood. This was not just a reward for the faithful. This was our true home, the place we were always meant to be. I wanted to run forward, to explore every part of this holy city, to kneel before the angels and join in their songs of praise. But just as I took a step forward, Jesus gently placed his hand on my shoulder. The warmth of his touch filled me with peace. But I could sense something else, a shift, a purpose, a reason why I had been brought here. As I looked into his eyes, I saw not just love, but urgency. "There is something I must show you," he said. And in an instant, the world around me changed. The light remained, but now I was no longer looking at heaven. Instead, I was looking down at the earth, down at the people I had left behind. I saw them as I had never seen them before, not just as individuals, but as souls, millions of souls, each one carrying a weight, a burden, a longing they didn't fully understand. I saw those who were suffering, those who were lost, those who had spent their lives searching for meaning in things that could never truly satisfy them. And then I saw something even more heartbreaking. I saw how many people believed they had time. They told themselves they would seek God someday, that they would pray more later, that they would surrender to Him when life wasn't so busy. But someday never came. Later never arrived. And one by one, I saw their time on earth come to an end, and they had never truly known Him. I felt my soul tremble as I watched. So many people lived as if they had all the time in the world, but their time was slipping away faster than they realized. Some were caught up in their careers, chasing after wealth, status, and approval, never stopping to ask themselves what truly mattered. Others drowned in fear, in pain, in bitterness, turning away from God, thinking He had abandoned them, when in reality He had never stopped calling their names. And worst of all, I saw those who believed in God but still waited. They went to church. They prayed when they remembered to, but deep in their hearts, they were not truly living for Him. They always thought they had more time, but time is never guaranteed. Tears streamed down my face as I turned to Jesus. "They don't see it," I whispered. "They don't understand how short life really is." He nodded, sorrow in his eyes. "This is why I am sending you back." My heart clenched at his words. Back. The thought of leaving heaven, of leaving His presence, was almost too painful to bear. I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay, to remain in this perfect place, to worship at His feet forever. But deep down I already knew the answer. This was not about what I wanted. It was about what He was calling me to do. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "What do you want me to say?" His gaze held mine, and though He spoke softly, His words carried a power that shook me to my core. "Tell them that I am waiting for them. Tell them that the time to seek me is now." I took a deep breath, my entire being trembling with the weight of the mission He was placing upon me. I would go back. I would return to the world, to my body, to my life. Not because I wanted to, but because He was asking me to. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never be the same again. The moment I whispered, "Lord, I will go," everything around me began to fade. The golden glow of heaven, the warmth of His presence, the music that filled the air, it all slipped away as I felt myself being pulled back. I wanted to hold on to that last moment, to stay in the presence of Jesus forever, but I knew this was His will. Then suddenly I gasped for air. My eyes flew open, and I was back in my bed, surrounded by the dim candlelight of my room. I could still hear the voices of my sisters praying, their words filled with sorrow, completely unaware that I had returned. I took another breath, deep, steady, impossible, and the moment they heard it, the prayer stopped. A stunned silence filled the room as I slowly sat up, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Strength. At first, no one moved. My sisters stared at me, their eyes wide, their hands covering their mouths as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then one of them gasped. Another let out a quiet, trembling cry, and then, all at once, the silence broke as whispers of shock and disbelief filled the room. "She's breathing. She's awake. She was gone. How is this possible?" The door burst open, and a doctor rushed in, his face pale as he approached my bed. He had been the one to tell my sisters there was no hope, the one who had prepared them for my final moments. But now he stood frozen, staring at me as if he were seeing a ghost. I was supposed to be dead. Instead, I was sitting up, breathing, alive. With shaking hands, he placed his stethoscope against my chest, listening for something, anything, that could explain what had happened. His brow furrowed as he checked my pulse, my reflexes, my breathing. Then suddenly he stopped. I saw his expression shift from confusion to something deeper. Disbelief, shock, fear. He turned to the nurses beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cancer, it's gone." Gasps filled the room as my sisters clutched their rosaries, some falling to their knees, others covering their mouths as tears streamed down their faces. They had been grieving my loss, preparing for the moment I would slip away forever. But instead, they were witnessing a miracle. I touched my chest, where the sickness had once been, but all I felt was wholeness, strength, life. I had returned, not just healed, but completely restored by the hands of God. Tears filled my eyes as I looked around the room, seeing the stunned faces of the people who had prayed over me, who had mourned me, who had never expected to hear my voice again. But I had returned with something far greater than just life. I had come back with a message, one that burned in my heart with an urgency I couldn't ignore. I had stood in the presence of Jesus. I had seen heaven, and now I had to tell the world. At first, no one spoke. How could they? How do you process something so impossible, so beyond human understanding? The doctor ran a hand over his face, shaking his head as if trying to wake himself from a dream. "This can't be real," he muttered, but the disbelief in his voice was cracking, his certainty crumbling. Finally, one of my sisters, her voice barely more than a whisper, asked, "Sister Angela, what happened?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. How could I possibly put into words what I had seen? How could I explain the light, the music, the overwhelming love that had filled every part of me? But as I opened my mouth, the words came, not rehearsed, not planned, but placed on my tongue as if Jesus himself was speaking through me. "I was with him," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "I was with Jesus." The room fell completely silent. I could see the shock, the wonder, and even the fear in their eyes. Some of them clutched their rosaries tighter, while others simply stared at me, waiting, desperate to understand what I had just said. My voice trembled as I continued. I saw heaven. I stood before Jesus, and he sent me back. One of the younger nuns gasped, covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Another sister, one who had been by my side throughout my illness, took a shaky step forward. "He sent you back," she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding with the weight of what I was about to say. "Yes, he gave me a message, and I have to share it." The doctor, still gripping his stethoscope as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded, let out a shaky breath. "A message," he echoed. He didn't sound skeptical anymore, just afraid of what my answer would be. I looked at each of them, my voice steady now, my purpose clear. "He told me to tell you that the time to seek him is now, not tomorrow, not later, now." A shiver ran through the room, as if my words had carried a weight beyond anything they had expected. Some of the sisters began to weep, their hands shaking as they pressed their rosaries to their lips. They understood. Deep down, they had always known how short life was, how fleeting time could be. But now they were hearing it from someone who had crossed the very threshold of eternity, someone who had stood before Jesus himself. But not everyone reacted the same way. I saw it in the doctor's eyes, the battle between logic and faith, between what he had been taught and what he had just witnessed with his own eyes. He had seen me dying. He had told my sisters to prepare for my final moments. And yet I was here, whole, healed, and speaking of a truth that defied everything he thought he knew. He wanted to believe me, but fear held him back. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I clasped them together. Jesus showed me how many people are waiting. My voice was steady now, carrying the urgency I had felt in his presence, waiting to seek him, waiting to surrender, waiting for the right time. But that time never comes. I looked at each of them, my heart aching. And then it's too late. A heavy silence filled the room. I could feel their hearts wrestling with the truth of my words. Some of them looked away, as if avoiding my gaze would make it easier to ignore what they already knew deep down. Others just stared at me, eyes wide, breath unsteady, as if they had been waiting their entire lives to hear this message. Jesus had not sent me back to give them comfort. He had sent me back to wake them up. The doctor finally spoke, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "But why you?" His question wasn't meant to challenge me. I could hear the desperation in his voice. Why had God chosen me to see heaven, to come back, to share this message? Why not someone else? I swallowed hard, my own heart trembling, because I had asked Jesus the very same thing. And his answer had been simple, because they need to hear it. I took another breath, steadying myself before I spoke again. Jesus told me that people believe they have time, but they don't. Tomorrow is not promised. Next week is not guaranteed. And yet, so many people are waiting. I clenched my hands together, trying to hold back the emotion rising in my chest. He is calling them now. He is waiting for them now. But will they answer? The weight of my words seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Some lowered their heads. Others wiped silent tears from their eyes. I knew it wasn't just my sisters who needed to hear this. It was the world. How many people were living their lives believing they had time? How many had pushed God aside, promising themselves they'd seek him later, not realizing that later might never come? I turned to the doctor, whose face had gone pale. He had spent his career placing his faith in science, in medicine, in what could be explained. But now he was standing in the presence of something he couldn't deny. I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, the war between his heart and his mind. He wanted to believe, but belief required surrender, and surrender was terrifying. I reached for his hand, my voice softer now, but just as firm. Jesus is real. Heaven is real, and he is calling you. He tensed under my touch, his breath shaky, his whole body trembling as if he had just stepped into a truth too big for him to grasp. "It's not too late," I whispered, "but one day it will be." Tears welled in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away, as if afraid to show weakness. I could see the struggle inside him, the part of him that wanted to hold onto reason, to dismiss this as impossible, and the part that knew deep down that he had just witnessed a miracle. Finally, he took a step back, running a hand over his face. "I don't understand," he whispered. But even as he spoke, I could hear it, the breaking of doubt, the crumbling of disbelief. He didn't understand, but he couldn't deny it. One of the sisters stepped forward, clutching my hands as if she were afraid I might disappear again. "Sister Angela, tell us what he showed you." Her voice trembled with emotion, her eyes searching mine for answers. I had been to the place we had prayed about our whole lives. I had seen what awaited those who truly loved him. And now I had to make them understand. I took a shaky breath, my heart pounding. "I saw heaven," I said softly. "I stood before Jesus, and he showed me what truly matters." The sisters leaned in, hanging on to every word. "He doesn't care about the things we chase after. Not wealth, not power, not the approval of others. The only thing that matters is our hearts. Are we living for him, or are we waiting?" A quiet sob broke the silence as one of the younger nuns covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I knew what she was feeling. It was the same thing I had felt when Jesus spoke those words to me. The crushing realization that so many people were wasting their lives chasing things that didn't matter. I had seen it from heaven's perspective. The jobs, the ambitions, the worries, the fears. None of it would last. The only thing that truly mattered was our relationship with God. I looked around the room, my voice steady but heavy with urgency. Jesus told me that too many people are waiting. They think they have time, but time is never guaranteed. I let the words sink in, watching as my sisters pressed their hands together in silent prayer. The doctor stood motionless, his eyes locked on me, his entire world shaken by the truth I had just spoken. How many times had he seen people take their last breath, never knowing if they had made things right with God? My own breath trembled as I spoke the words that had been burning in my heart since the moment I returned. Jesus is not waiting for someday. He is calling you now. I looked at each of them, my voice unwavering. The question is, will you answer? The room was completely still. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. I could feel the weight of my words pressing on their hearts, just as Jesus had pressed them onto mine. Some of them had spent their entire lives in faith. Yet even they had moments of waiting, of putting things off, of thinking there would always be more time. But now they knew the truth. There was no more time to waste. The doctor let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling at his sides. I could see it, the realization crashing over him like a wave. He had spent years in hospitals, watching people slip away, telling families there was nothing more he could do. How many of them had died without ever truly knowing Jesus? How many had thought they still had time? His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. One of the nuns, still gripping her rosary, whispered through her tears, "Sister Angela, what do we do?" My own eyes burned as I reached for her hands, holding them tightly. "We stop waiting," I said, my voice shaking but strong. "We surrender. Right now, this moment. We give him everything." And as I spoke those words, I felt it, a presence in the room, something holy, something real. Jesus was here. A soft gasp came from one of the sisters, and I knew she felt it too. The presence of Jesus was among us. It wasn't just my words moving them, it was him. I watched as tears slipped down their faces, as hands that had once been clasped in fear slowly opened in surrender. He was calling them, just as he had called me, and this time they were ready to listen. The doctor took an unsteady step forward, his breathing uneven. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I stop waiting?" His words sent a shiver through me. I had seen this moment in my vision. I had seen hearts wrestling with doubt, with fear, with the choice between surrender and hesitation. Jesus had shown me how many would be too afraid to take that step. But right here, right now, this man was choosing to ask. I reached for his hands, just as Jesus had reached for mine in heaven. "You don't have to understand everything," I told him softly. "You just have to say yes." His fingers trembled in mine, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The battle was ending. His heart had been waiting for this moment his entire life, and at last he was ready. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but no words came, only a deep, shuddering breath, as if the weight he had been carrying for years was finally breaking. I could see it in his eyes. He had spent his whole life relying on science, on facts, on what could be measured and explained. But now he was standing in the presence of something that defied all logic. He had seen a miracle with his own eyes. He had no choice but to believe. Slowly he lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as he whispered, "Jesus, I don't want to wait anymore." The moment he spoke those words, something shifted in the room. It was as if the very air had changed. A peace so powerful, so overwhelming, that it wrapped around all of us like an embrace. One by one, my sisters dropped to their knees, their hands lifted, their voices breaking into prayer. Some wept. Others whispered, "Yes, Lord, I surrender." Tears blurred my vision as I watched them, my heart pounding with something greater than joy. This was why Jesus had sent me back. Not for myself, not for my own healing, but for this moment. For them. For everyone who would hear my story and know that Jesus was waiting for them too. I looked around the room, at the faces filled with awe, with surrender, with love, and with all the strength in my heart, I spoke the words that had been burning inside me since the moment I returned. Heaven is real. Jesus is calling you. The only question is, will you answer? If this testimony spoke to you, don't wait. Give your heart to Jesus today. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truth of faith, heaven, and God's love. Jesus is waiting, but will you come?